Afternoon. Welcome everyone. This event hosted by Wyndham Libraries in partnership with our friends from the Sun Bookshop Yarraville down the back there. My name is Anita and I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land we meet today here at Point Cook Library. We also acknowledge their neighbours, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations. We pay respect to ancestors and elders who always have and always will care for country and community today and for future generations. To start with, just a housekeeping point, this event is being live streamed, so just asking everyone to keep your chatter to a minimum so that those at home watching online or on the go, wherever they might be watching online, don't pick up on that noise and can follow along the event. And without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dervla McTiernan and Gabriel Bergmoser here to Wyndham Point Cook today. It would be no surprise to those of you here who probably read Dervla's books to hear that she is very well borrowed here at Wyndham, very rarely on the shelves if you've tried to borrow from the library. And those her previous titles, The Ruin, The Scholar, The Good Turn, Following Cormac Riley, they're incredibly well borrowed. Her latest title, The Murder Rule, also not on the shelf, and it's her first ever standalone thriller. We look forward to hearing more about it today. We're equally delighted to have playwright and writer Gabriel Bergmoser join us today. Gabriel's most recent book, The Inheritance, is a gritty urban suspense thriller set here on the streets of Melbourne. There will be time for questions from the audience at the end of the talk, so please hold on to those for the end. And without further ado, I'll pass on to you both. Thank you for being with us here today.
All right, so I think first I just want to, in the interest of full disclosure, lay out how absolutely terrified I am to be talking to Dervla right now. I mean, obviously, you know, Dervla needs no introduction. You're why we're all here. You're an absolute rock star, and this is my first ever interview event, so I'm kind of sitting here being like, don't screw it up, don't screw it up, don't screw it up, don't screw it up. So, you know, I'll do my best. And I think, you know, one of the reasons that I guess I feel so intimidated right now is that there's something always incredibly exhilarating when a very popular and well-respected author does a really sharp pivot. You know, it's always like a massive risk, right? You know, going from one genre to another. And you've kind of pivoted in several ways with this book. You've gone from murder mystery to legal thriller, you've gone from series to standalone, you've gone from Ireland to America, and you've made doing all of those things look incredibly easy, which, like, for any other writer is, you know, kind of daunting and immensely jealousy inducing. So I guess I wanted to kind of kick off by asking a little bit about, you know, the pivot into legal thriller. Was that a genre that you always wanted to explore or were interested in exploring, or was it something that sort of came up more recently?
Wow. Well, first of all, I don't think anyone's ever been intimidated by me before in their life, so this has been a very interesting first experience. Thank you. The decision to move the book to the States and the decision to write a book that had some legal thriller elements was just driven by the story, really. I came across a newspaper article a few years ago about a young Irish law student who had volunteered for the summer in the States working for the Innocence Project. And when she came back to Ireland, she couldn't let go of the case that she'd been working, so she kept making phone calls and following up. And she ultimately tracked down a retired police officer who pointed her to some evidence that had been hidden in the original case. Are you guys familiar with the Innocence Project? I should ask that first, probably. So it's about 50-50. So the Innocence Project is a group, kind of a loosely affiliated set of groups of lawyers who work for free for indigent prisoners who can't afford representation. And they first came to prominence when DNA testing became a thing, because they could prove that people who were either sitting on death row or who had actually been executed were innocent. But they still exist today and they still do extremely good work. And this young law student volunteered for them, came home to Ireland, ultimately tracked down this evidence, and because of her work, a man was freed from prison who spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, which was massively inspirational, you know. I mean, it was an amazing story, and all the more marked for me because I was a young law student in the States once, but I worked as a chambermaid and a waitress, and I basically had a good time and didn't do anything to change the world. But I didn't feel like there was a story there for me to write. You know, it was told, that story. There was nothing for me to add. And it was only a few years later I came across the article again. I did a bit more research and I found out that after she found the evidence, it took 5 more years for that case to be heard, by which point Walter Swift had spent 26 years in prison and he only had 3 years left to run his original sentence. which was so sad and so dark. And I just thought, why did we get the more inspirational take in all those articles I read first, you know? Why was it kind of cleaned up for public consumption? And I thought, well, maybe the editors of the various newspapers thought this was the more inspirational take, and I had no reason to think this except my own head. What if the Innocence Project had this sophisticated PR team? They were sending out these more inspirational stories because it would get more eyes on the stories, which could generate more support, which made me think, if they were, would I blame them? Because this is a really busy, noisy world we're all living in. It's very hard to get anybody to care about anything. So maybe it's justifiable to take a step off that straight and narrow path. But once you take that step, do you take the next step? Do you take the next step? And that made me think, oh, there's a story here I wanted to write. And as soon as I started thinking like that, I had to write, which meant it had to be in America. And there was always going to be a legal element to it. It was story driven. That's a very long way of answering your question.
No, that's a great answer. And I mean, you know, a little bit later on, I guess we'll delve into what I think is my favorite thing about the book, which is this, what you kind of alluded to there, this absolute commitment to moral ambiguity across the board. Because I feel like we don't get as much of that anymore these days, and so I found that really refreshing. But we'll get to that. I've got so much to get through. But I guess just kind of sticking briefly on the theme of intimidation, did you feel intimidated, like moving away from, you know, a very successful run in the murder mystery sphere into this different genre? Like, were you ever worried about, you know, is it going to land? Can I do it? I mean, you've nailed it, obviously, spoiler alert, but just, yeah.
I wasn't. I guess I was just totally naive. It was only like after the book was finished, edited, in between the covers, and I was out on the road, that people started saying, wow, you must have been really scared. What a risk you took. And I went, oh shit, I did take it. But you know, maybe there was a risk here because the books had been commercially very successful, and then you know, I was doing something very different, and a lot of people really like Cormac writing, and they really like the Irish setting, and you're asking people to go somewhere completely different with you and kind of trust you, you know. But I always say, like, one of my favorite writers in the world, probably my favorite writer in the world, is Stephen King. And I open his book cover and I see the list of books that he's written, and I think I want that list someday. And he's still writing because he loves to write. There's no other reason in the world for that man to be writing. But he just continues to just have this endless creativity. And I feel like, I mean, I don't know the man, but I feel like he writes from a place of joy. And I think that my theory is it comes from the fact that he's unconstrained. He writes what he wants to write. He writes what he cares about. He writes what he's interested in and passionate about. And that's why he continues to make great books. And I think as a writer, you have to do that. I don't mind what name people put on my books after they've written them. That's totally cool with me. But I would like to feel unconstrained in what I write as much as possible. I know that that's tricky because readers really often want to know what they're getting. But I kind of feel like if you can trust me that I'll give you a good read, even if it changes a bit from book to book, I hope that people will stay with me, you know?
Yeah, and I think, you know, coming at it from that place of creative and emotional honesty, I think does put you in good stead to make sure that it is going to be a good read every time. I mean, you know, was it Philip Pullman who said that thing about how he doesn't think about genre is for his publisher to decide?
Yeah.
And he kind of, I mean, you know, which is very easy to say when you're Philip Pullman,
Yeah.
but there is something, you know, really lovely about that. And even like when it comes to Stephen King, like it's funny you should mention him because I've just started reading Billy Summers, you know, his you, and yeah, and already like I'm reading it, and I'm just thinking, he's written this, like, aren't you done? Aren't you like, you know, worn out and used up? But it's like, it's so vital and different and fresh and like kind of feels like such a sharp pivot away from so much of what he's done.
Yeah.
But it's still excellent. It's still Stephen King and you still trust it. Like,
and every book feels like a Stephen King book,
Absolutely.
Even if it's he writes crime with a slight paranormal bent, he writes full-blown horror, he writes fantasy, but every time you know it's him, you know? And I think
Yeah.
that's really special.
There's no mistaking his writing for anyone else's, which is, you know, I guess what we all kind of aspire to.
Yeah.
So do you think that like the legal sphere is something you could potentially return to, or like a lane you might want to stay in for a little bit, or are you thinking you go back to mysteries?
The next one, I don't know how you categorize it really, but it doesn't have a legal element to it. It's not, I wasn't driven to write this book by the fact that there would be a courtroom scene or two, because there's very little of that. It really only appears towards the end. And that wouldn't have interested me. I didn't want to write a full-blown legal thriller as such. What I liked about the idea of working with the Innocence Project is because it has to be staffed by volunteers largely. I mean, usually these little groups are associated with the university. There might be a few professors or some staff lawyers involved, but there are a lot of young students volunteering. That's the bit I kind of found exciting. You know, the idea of these 20-something-year-olds going out and interviewing witnesses and making phone calls and tracking down evidence. They're so young. And I remember when I qualified as a lawyer, and the first time I was sent to court, and I was just asked to get a date for cross-examination from the Master of the High Court, and I had never appeared in court before, and I was terrified. And my training solicitor said, just wait till the list has been called over, stand at the back of the courtroom, wait till everybody else is gone, and then just say, excuse me, Master, could I please have a date for cross-examination in case number, whatever. So I was sitting at the back of the class going, excuse me, Master, please, practicing, waiting for everybody to go. And then at the end, there were two sets of barristers who were obviously waiting for something else. And they all turned around and looked at me like, what are you doing here? And I stood up to ask my little thing, purple in the face. I mean, I was so scared and just went away shaking for the rest of the day. It was stupid. And then I see these 20-something-year-olds who are going out doing this work that actually really matters. And that's what they do it. I went to the University of Virginia, I snuck onto campus, went into the law building, went to their canteen, sat and talked to a couple of guys who had done that work the previous year. It's hard to wrap our heads around sometimes that the lives of people could be in the hands of people so young, but it is.
Do you think that comes from, like, I guess, for want of a better word or phrase, like a supernatural level of confidence? Or do you think in some ways it comes from like a sheer belief in the rightness of what they're doing? Because like I'm in the same boat as you, like going up and like interviewing a witness or whatever would be absolutely terrifying. Like I turn it on and run away in a heartbeat, but you know, these people do it and they're younger than I am.
Yeah.
But what do you think it is?
I think it's actually a combination of both of those things. I mean, the University of Virginia is one of the most elite law schools in the US. It's very difficult to get into. So those young people who make it that far, particularly these days, they've usually had to work and fight for that their whole lives. You know, they're working from the time they're 12 to get into a good undergraduate program, and then they have to be the best of those to get into this postgraduate program. So very ambitious, they're very focused, and then they care, and they have support. You know, they're not doing it from nothing. They have lawyers there supporting them, teaching them, and leading them. So they're doing it in that supported environment, but they're very smart and they're very driven.
I just want to ask quickly before I go on to the next question, which builds on this a little bit. How many people here have read The Murder Rule already? Okay, a few, so I'll steer clear of any spoilers, because there's so much to delve into with this book, as you know. And but regarding the sort of, you know, the young characters who sit at the heart of this, like Hannah and the others, they're so vividly drawn and they're so interesting, and he honestly left me thinking. I know it's marketed as a standalone, but are these characters you would return to at some point? Because you can imagine like a series of them kind of delving into other cases and like sort of other more complex situations and everything. And it feels like it kind of sets it up really nicely for that. But I'm not sure if that was like on your mind, or if it is on your mind, or if you're allowed to say. But as a fan of this book, I have to ask.
It wasn't on my mind as I was writing it. So for anybody who doesn't know what the story is about, it follows Hannah Rokeby, who is this young idealistic law student. She joins the Innocence Project at the eve of their biggest case. They're trying to save somebody from death row. And so she appears to be everything you'd expect, you know, clever, eager to please, you know, wants to change the world, but she's not like that at all. She, at the beginning of the book, she's actually very ruthless and incredibly focused and absolutely believes she is right. And she has to go on quite a journey through the book, you know, to grow as a person. Without giving any spoilers away, I feel at the end of the book, she's just become a person in a way.
Yeah.
You know, she's quite fractured at the beginning, though she wouldn't see herself like that. By the end, she's changed quite a bit. So I definitely think there's potential to go and do something with her and with some of the other young students, and it would be fun, but it's not the book I'm writing.
Fair enough. I mean, and so on the note of Hannah, like I want to delve into a little bit I guess the themed moral ambiguity that keeps coming up in this book, because to me that was what I found so immensely thrilling. Like, I don't know, I tend to find in, I guess, a world of like Marvel movies and the like, you know, we sort of seem to exist in a time where like a lot of our entertainment is extremely morally binary. Like these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, and people don't often sort of veer outside of that. But this book has this exhilarating, refreshing willingness to kind of get into the murk of the fact that sometimes good people do bad things, sometimes bad people do good things, sometimes victims don't have to be perpetrators, sometimes perpetrators have to be victims. And you know, our main character, like you said, she's very ruthless. I mean, she She blackmails, she lies, she commits fraud.
Joy.
It's just fantastic, the great mentoring. And part of the thrill of the book that pulled me in early on was just being like, oh, what's she going to do next? Like, what terrible thing is she going to do next? But it was so riveting, it was so compelling because she's doing terrible things and she's screwing over some ultimately innocent people, but for what she believes is the most noble cause. And of course, the book goes on, we sort of learn it's more complicated than that. And I found that so compelling. So was that kind of, moral ambiguity and I guess the grey areas of right and wrong, was that something you pointedly wanted to delve into coming into the book, or was that something that kind of emerged more naturally as you went?
It's definitely something I wanted to talk about a lot in the book, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think, have you guys read that Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that came out a few years ago? It's a really fascinating non-fiction book, and he talks a lot about how human brains work versus how we think they work. And there are a lot of different things in the book. But one of the things he talks about is how we all think we are quite logical creatures. We think, we go out, we take up the evidence, we read everything, we consider it, and we go, okay, this is my decision, this is what I believe. But in fact, that's not how our brains work at all, because it would be exhausting. We couldn't maintain the level of energy that would take to make all our decisions in that way. So what we actually do is we make our decision first about what we think, and then we seek out little pieces of information to confirm our bias. That's just how we've evolved. It doesn't make us bad or good, it's just that's how we work. I think the problem is that social media supercharges that process. So where before we would encounter people who have different opinions for us more frequently, possibly, we spend more time with our communities, and we're probably a little bit more willing to hear about other opinions from people we care about. In a social media environment, our existing biases are just all we tend to hear then. Once you click on one thing, you're fed a stream of that thing. And it just reaffirms our belief deeper and deeper, which is why I think we're seeing people moving into such silos. We're just in opposite camps. Once that happens, we will not listen to anybody else, because we are evolved to just focus on our own bias. And I'm really interested in that idea, and I'm really interested in trying to talk about it, just maybe shining a light on that through fiction, that without beating anybody over the head with a lesson or a moral, because I couldn't think of anything worse than doing that in a book. I was interested in this thought of, do we realize the degree to which we ignore facts that contradict what we want to believe? All of us, on every side of the spectrum. And I don't think we do. So I wanted to kind of show that a little bit. We've got corrupt police officers in this book because that is a reality, but we also have people who are doing a lot of good who maybe don't realize that they too are capable of bias, and they too are capable of closing their eyes to facts that don't suit their own narrative or set of beliefs.
Well, I mean, everyone's ultimately the hero in their own story, right? And it's just, I find myself nodding along to all of that because it's something I find so simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, is the way that social media puts us in these echo chambers. And you see people who are largely intelligent, open-minded, so surrounded by affirmation of their biases that it gets to the point where it's very understandable that you can arrive at a place where anything that challenges those biases is seen as abhorrent or wrong, because you're constantly being reinforced, and that is a terrifying thing. And you can imagine how in something like the Innocence Project that could become so supercharged, because at the heart of it is this belief of we are doing right. And if you believe you have a moral high ground, then how easy would it be to just, completely believe in, I guess, the correctness of every choice you make? And it is kind of terrifying. It is kind of fascinating. I don't think there is an easy answer to it. And again, that's what I love about the book, is the fact that it doesn't shy away from the fact that sometimes there aren't easy answers. There are no easy answers in this book. And it's one of the things that, particularly towards the end, I found myself being like, how are you going to wrap this up? Because, I don't know how you're, I don't know what kind of resolution to come to with it. And I think you do land on a resolution that is both satisfying, but quite clear-eyed in its unwillingness to give, very easy answers to anything, which I really love.
Gabriel, that's really nice to hear. It is always, you probably feel that dangerous moment as you're coming towards the end of the book going, am I going to be able to land this bloody thing? And sometimes it takes a few goes, but I kind of knew an answer that I wanted to give at a certain point, and there's a this isn't I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's a lawyer in the book, a guy called Robert Perec, and he's Hannah encounters him early on, and she's not very impressed. You know, he's extremely good looking, very handsome, very charming, and quite aware of his effect on people, and very willing to use it to his own ends. So she's quite judgmental about him right from the start. And she's like, this guy, he's into himself, he's about himself, he wants to push his own, you know, personal profile. He doesn't care about what he's really doing here. But I think she's misunderstood him. You guys can make up your own minds about him when you read the book, but they do have a conversation quite late in the book where she says to him, why do you do this anyway? Why do you, tell me honestly why you do this, why you represent these prisoners, why you do this work? And he just basically says, well, there's no other option. This is just the basic, bare minimum maintenance of the system. If we don't go in here and ask these questions and push back, the whole house falls down. So I do it so that I've got somewhere to sleep at the end of the day. And I always think like that. Like, we live in this country, we are so lucky. You know, we are so lucky that we have a safe place to raise our children. And it's easy to take that for granted in the minutiae of the smaller things that go wrong, you know. But this is a safe, secure democracy. And that is not something we can take for granted anymore, you know. But we have to maintain the system. We've got to ask the awkward questions and push back a little bit and just be citizens. And I'm sorry to sound so Pollyanna-ish about things, but I do think it's really important.
But I think, you know, the book doesn't shy away from challenging intention there. And, you know, one of the things I found that kind of hooked me in immediately was pretty much the prologue. And for those who've read the book, and I don't think it's much of a spoiler for those who haven't, because it's literally the prologue, but, you know, it opens with this email exchange between Hannah and Robert. And it's her basically trying to get into the Innocence Project and him saying, no, there isn't room. And then she, not very subtly, but directly enough that we know what's going on, accuses him of something.
Yeah.
And then he sends an email back being like, yep, okay, cool, you can come on in. And straight away I was like, oh God. And it's like, it's that thing where, you know, I personally think that the skill of pulling people in, or what I find represented in the books that I really love, is starting with a question that you want answered. And then by the time you get to the answer of that question, the author has introduced like 5 other questions that you also want answered, and that's how you suddenly get reeled in. But straight away, you know, I was pulled in from that prologue and I was like, I want to find out what happens when she talks to Robert. Like, what's going to happen when she actually comes face to face with this guy who she's made this accusation of. And then she does come face to face with him, and straight away he indicates to her, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than you think it is.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the theme of the book was like very clearly established right there. But straight away I was like, all right, so what else is not as black and white as we think it is? What else is more complicated? And that kind of like, you know, lets it pull me in sort of bit by bit. But on that note of the opening chapter, was that something you were consciously trying to do, like plant a question, pull people in, sort of start those seeds? Like, how do you, because it's one thing that writers always tend to grapple with, is how do you start a story? How do you make people stick with you for the first few pages to get hooked enough to continue when there are millions and millions of books in the world and there's so much content out there? Like, is starting your story in a way that grabs people as much as possible something that you put a lot of thought into? And if so, can you, just for my own selfish benefit, talk a little bit to your process and how you pull that off?
Yeah, I think an awful lot about how to start a book. It's obviously the most important part. If we don't have you from the beginning, then it's very hard to ask people to keep going. And particularly these days, we've got so many other things vying for our attention. I think this is going to make me sound very well read, but actually I got it from a YouTube video. Apparently, Aristotle said about writing that a good story needed to have 3 elements: pity, fear, catharsis. And by pity, he means empathy for the character. If you feel empathy for the character you're in, and then you put them in dangerous stakes, something that matters, and you're worried for them, you know, the fear, and then catharsis, there's a resolution. And I just think that's terribly simple, but the most important thing, because you can have, you know, nuclear explosions and you don't care if you don't care about the character, and you can have a missing crisp packet and it's devastating in the right circumstances, you know, because you care. So the first thing is to try to, for me, create a character that I care deeply about, because if I don't care, there's no way you're going to care. And then I've got to find a way to give you a picture of him or her very fast in a few pages. I've never, in this book, it starts with the email exchange. I've never done anything like that before. I totally stole it from Ruth Ware, who opens one of her books with some letters. And I read that book and went, oh my God, I am in. she did it so beautifully. I thought that's an idea I'm going to steal. I'm quite happy to steal ideas when I can. So I did that. But you know, it's always editing, isn't it? It's editing and writing and rewriting and rewriting, and that's where it starts to get good. It's never that great in the beginning.
Not as much as we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
So on that then, I'm always curious about this binary. Do you think you're more of like a meticulous plotter or a sort of discovery writer who finds it as you go? Like, how much planning do you do in the interim before you actually put pen to paper?
Oh my God, so much planning, color-coded spreadsheets, plotting timeline apps. Like, I've never met an app I didn't like to procrastinate with. But over the course of the books, I've kind of worked out a process that I've found to be pretty reliable. And when I move away from it, I tend to regret it. So I do start with a character I love, that I really care about. With the Ruin, it was always Maud. You know, with the Scholar, it was Della Lambert, even though she didn't really appear in the page. And with this book, it was Hannah. And I write a lot about that character. Like, I'll literally take like a character prompt sheet and I will work out, you know, okay, where was she born? Who was her first boyfriend? What was that breakup like? You know, did she fracture her ankle playing sport? You know, stupid details that will never appear in the book, but they start to make her come to life for me. And they lead to other characters. Her mother will come from that process, maybe her best friend, her boy, you know, all that stuff. Once I've worked that out, I will generally have already some idea of the story, and I'll write down a little paragraph on about 7 to 10 scenes that I'm really excited to write about. It doesn't matter where they appear in the book or if they even make logical sense. It's just like, oh, that would be fun to write. Then I'll do a brief outline, and then I'll usually write about 30,000 words, at which point I should have found the voice of the book and where the really good bits of the story are, and then I'll start again. I write a full detailed outline and then I'll start writing. But if the outline starts to fail me, like if the book starts to die, which it does sometimes, you start to recognize, oh, it feels wooden, like it's lost its heart. I now recognize that earlier. I'll stop and I'll go back and go again. So I think it's a combination of being planned it out really deeply, but also being free to move where the story wants to go.
Do you ever find that, because I mean, I think that's, at least for me, the best way to do it is like, you know, to have some idea of where you're going. If you don't, you can tend to get a bit lost, and you can just sort of, you know, basically if you're making it up, you tend to just sort of end up being like, wait, where am I going? What's happening? How is this ending? And you have to sort of do all of that. But so it's good to kind of know, I think, what you're working towards, but then to have the flexibility to change the plan as it goes on, because otherwise we end up with the Game of Thrones finale. So, you know, I do think that is, but I'm curious about, because something happens to me a lot, something that I hear a lot of writers talk about. Do you ever have characters like surprise you, or like do things you don't expect, or kind of, you know, you're writing this and you go, oh my God, that's not what you're doing, that's what you're doing, or that's not what you're planning, like, or more than characters as well. Do you ever have like plot points abruptly come up that you don't see coming and you kind of get as surprised by as your audience does?
Yeah, 100%. And I remember in my early days as a writer, I would read other writers talking about this stuff. Like Liz Gilbert talks about stories being things that drift into your mind, and if you don't catch them, they go into the next writer, you know. And other writers, I think it might be Stephen King, when talking about stories being found things that you excavate, they exist before you get to them. And at the time I thought, what a bullshit, you know, because it just sounds like nonsense, doesn't it? But actually it does feel that way. I think once you have fed enough into the characters that they start to come to life, they feel real to you in the sense that, like if I said to you today, okay, after this, you have to go to your mother's house and you have to tell her that you crashed your car and your sister's there. Well, you can imagine their responses straight away. You can picture the kitchen, you can picture exactly what they're going to say, who's going to be nice, who's not going to be nice, everything. Once you've put enough work into the characters, they're like that. They feel like real people to the degree that you can put them in a scenario and they sort of just start doing things. And then you can write those things. And it's brilliant when that happens. And sometimes, like a lot of the time, the twists you have to work out pretty hard at to make those come off in a book. But sometimes they're just serendipitous. Like the big twist in this book, I won't mention what it is, but there is one big surprise late in the book that was completely organic. It occurred to me like a chapter before I wrote it. And the really lovely ones, they just fit so beautifully. They tie everything up. And it's such a good feeling when that happens. You must happen to you, Gabe.
Well, it's happened to me a couple of times, and it's always the same thing happens every time, where somebody will come up to me and I'll be like, oh my God, that's amazing. How did you think of that? And I'm like, I didn't, but, you know, thank you. Because it's one of those weird things where it's like sometimes those things just like pop into your head fully formed and you just kind of go with it. And you sit there and you think, where did that come from? And like, obviously it must have come from like somewhere in your head, but you almost kind of feel like you can't take credit for it because it just sort of like came from some strange amorphous ether out there that's like just happened to grant you this beautiful thing that then you get to take credit for. It's fantastic, but I don't know. I always feel like a bit of a fraud when that stuff comes up because
Have you read Big Magic, Elizabeth Gilbert's writing? You should so read it because that's exactly what she believes, and she said it how helpful it is for her. You know, do you know Elizabeth Gilbert? She wrote Prologue, and she's written about novels and stuff. And she's obviously had massive success, but she talks about it like that, like it's a separate thing from her. And she said it's been hugely helpful in terms of like keeping her feet on the ground and keeping her happy as a writer, because it's like whether her book is this massive #1 worldwide bestseller or not has very little to do with her. She just wrote what the muse wanted her to write, you know. It's not her, it's this separate thing. I think it feels like that sometimes.
Well, it's something that I often, if I'm working on something that's not, you know, it's not coming the way it's supposed to come, or it's not, you know, flowing or whatever, and people ask me like, oh, how's the book coming along or whatever, and the worst thing I can say is, it's got to the point where I'm making stuff up, and people are always like, that's
your job.
Literally your job description. I'm like, no, but it's not though. You don't get it. It's this magical thing that we said, of course, makes you sound like a complete wanker, so you have to kind of, you know, shut up at that point. But I think it is true. Like, you know, I think that we do just kind of, you know, we turn things over in our head until we eventually kind of find them. But even like you don't sit down and mathematically come up with the idea for a book, you know, and an idea will snag you, or you'll see something, or you'll read a line in something and you'll go, oh, hang on, and then you start turning it over. And that's when I think the Stephen King excavation analogy comes into it, because it's like, you know, you're digging up a dinosaur skeleton, you know, you're getting rid of the rocks and you're putting things away, and, you know, then you get all the pieces and you try to put them together in the right order, and they're not the right order, and then eventually you figure out the T-Rex looks like this and the Stegosaurus looks like this. But it is like, it does kind of feel like this sort of, you know, stumbling in the dark with your shin until you find something soft kind of process of trial and error, you know, a lot of times. And which again is why I think it's often, you know, not something that we can take credit for when we happen on really good things. Yeah.
Well, it's one thing of the job, I suppose, you know. Yeah. I mean, I do plan a lot, but I love when the organic part takes off. It's a pretty good feeling.
Do you ever have a moment, you know, it's my favorite thing if I'm like, because I go for really long walks to like plan out, you know, or to think through what happens next. And my dog hates me because I'm walking along, and the good moments when I stop abruptly and I'm like, of course it's that. And it just kind of feels like it's so blindingly obvious, and Humphrey's just glaring at me like, you know, I've done something unforgivable because how dare I stop our walk so abruptly to like let the muse speak to me or whatever. But it is like just a beautiful part of the process.
It's pretty great. I mean, it does happen sometimes. I think the best times for writing are when you are in your book, when you're not in your book, you know, when life hasn't distracted you. So, this year was a little bit weird because I think of COVID. So I found that when I wasn't actually actively writing the book, I was very distracted. I was thinking about COVID stuff, or I was scrolling on the internet, or I was involved in family things, and I just wasn't in the book. So those moments were rarer, but they're still good. I was in the States just last week, and I was flying back, and everything was dark and everybody was really quiet, either asleep or watching their movies, and I was like, and I realized how to finish the book I'm writing right now, because I didn't want somebody to have done it, you know. I really like him and I didn't want him to be guilty, but I didn't have another answer, and then I figured it out, and I was there scribbling on my iPad in the dark, and it was such a fun feeling, you know. It's really good.
I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the Innocence Project for a moment, because I think you've touched on all the reasons why it's such a fascinating topic for a book, but one thing that you delve into, and this comes back to, I guess, the theme of ambiguity, is how pure the intentions of the people working there are. And you touched on that before with Robert, and it comes up with the other students as well. Like, what are you doing there? You know, how do you, you know, why do you think what you're doing is right? Why are you so sure of your own righteousness? But I guess it leads to this really fascinating question that I guess I want to get your take on, because the book does explore it, but I'd love to hear you speak to it a little bit more, which is, I guess, that question of, are good actions ultimately undermined by selfish intentions? Because Hannah has this very early on, this cynicism towards the work of the Innocence Project because of her impression of Robert, because of her impression of what's going on there, and because of her beliefs about the case that they're working on and everything. But that kind of leads her to really be quite critical of it. But ultimately, you do kind of feel like the work that they're doing is a net good in the end. But is that undermined if the intentions are selfish, if the intentions are about self-aggrandizement, if the intentions are about making themselves look or feel good? Does that lessen the impact of the action, do you believe? It's a very philosophical question, but you wrote the book, so.
It's my fault. I think if you'd asked me that a few years ago, my answer would be different. You know, I think I was younger and I think the world was a different place, and I probably would have said, you know, intention is so important. Now I'm more inclined to say outcome is the most important thing. You know, actions speak louder than words. If we are waiting for only the purest of people to stand up, we're going to be waiting for a very long time. And we need to see good things happen. And look, the reality is none of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. And my God, we're not allowed to be perfect in this world. You know, I think, was it Solzhenitsyn who talked, when he defected to America, he talked about, he gave a talk at one of the big universities, and he stood up and people expected him to laud America because, you know, he'd been able to leave the USSR, he'd come to America, he was living in a free country, and he talked about the free press in America. And again, people thought he was going to praise them, and instead he just ripped them apart and said, it is so hard to be a good person in this world because as soon as a leader stands up, the smallest mistake and they're ripped to shreds. So where is the room for good intention there? Because it all becomes a game then, doesn't it? It's, you know, a game of sound bites. So now I'm sort of inclined to think, look, what we need is people who are able to live in the world as it is, not the world we wish we had, and still care enough to make a difference. And there are people like that out there. And sometimes they can be almost a bit overpowering because they're such operators, you know. And you can distrust them because they're operators. And Robert Preck is an operator in this book. Like he knows what he's doing. And it's hard to trust somebody like that. But I think once you see them do what they do and they do it consistently, then you can start to trust. So for me, the perfect intention is not necessary. Although I would say Preck's intentions are good.
Yeah.
The fact that he is somewhat of a cynic and he sees the world as it is doesn't change that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had years and years ago, I lived with this girl, and she had this friend who we always dreaded coming around to the house because she was just the worst person in the world, except for the fact that she was incredibly ethical in every choice she made in her life. You know, she was an activist, she was a paramedic, you know, she literally saved people's lives. She was like strict vegan, like did all this like, you know, animal care stuff and everything. You know, she did far more good in the world than I've ever had. But she was so rude, so adversarial, so unpleasant, and just seemed to genuinely believe that everything she did made her better than everyone else. You know, she would do things where she would like come to a party and like open the oven, remove the tray of sausage rolls that were halfway through cooking, put in her own vegan food, and then turn to the host and say, "Come and get me when my food's done," and just leave. And it was things like that constantly. And everybody was just like, "Oh, she's the worst." But you kind of can't think that because
you just can't.
I'm glad you said that because I still think that. I still like, if any circumstance arises where I have to spend more than 5 minutes in this person's company, I dread it. I start, you know, like looking towards the door. But at the same time, it's like, as my friend who was her friend always points out, she's like, well, she does a lot of really good things. And, you know, she's literally saved people's lives. I've never done that.
Yeah, so, but I feel like she's waiting to, like, I don't know, set a bomb off or something. There's something lurking there. It's only a matter of time.
When she mentioned snaps, I'll be like, I knew it. I was right. It wasn't just because her good actions made me deeply insecure about my lack of, you know, positive impact on the world. But no, it is interesting because it does sort of. It's like, do you ever watch The Good Place?
Yeah, I love The Good Place.
Yeah, you remember, was it Mindy St. Clair, the woman who was like this coke-addled, completely selfish 80s lawyer, and in death, she accidentally, I don't remember the exact plot point, but she accidentally saved like a busload of children.
Yeah.
And so she didn't end up going to heaven or hell. She just went to this in-between place. Yeah. But she was this awful human being who just happened to have done a good thing. And I don't know, I thought that show was like very interesting how it delved into that. You know, how can you actually be a good person in a world that's so stacked against you? So I'm going to ask a bit of a widely question because, you know, again, I'm curious about picking your brain and taking advantage of the opportunity. But you spoke a little bit about the how much planning you do and sort of the organic, you know, the point where the story starts happening organically, you start discovering things. To what degree do you use like classic structure techniques? Like, do you think in terms of, you know, your 3-act structure, 5-act structure, any of those things? Do you come back to that later, or do you sort of in the initial planning process use that at all? I know it's kind of more of a screen thing than a novel thing per se, but I'm always fascinated by how closely writers adhere to that stuff.
Not that much anymore, but I definitely used to use it quite a bit. I think sometimes I think it's like a I don't know, we fool ourselves into thinking it's useful, you know, because it gives us some sort of structure that we can hang things on. Like, it's a scary thing writing a book. You're hanging out there, you're creating something out of nothing. Like, I give myself a daily word target that I want to hit, and like, I'm really over the top about it. I look 3 weeks ahead and I'll say, okay, that day's a 3,000 word day, but that day's only a 2,500 word day because Frey's got a doctor's appointment, and you know, all this stuff. And it's a total delusion, because I could write for those 3 weeks and then cut every word, you know, but it makes me feel better because I'm ticking a box at the end of the day. And when I'm using a character prompt sheet, you know, I don't really need that, but it helps my imagination to spark off. And if I set out a 3-act structure and I say, okay, that's my turning point, that's my middle, that's my whatever, it can help me to just hang my hat on something for a little while. But I don't know that it is that useful. I don't know, do you ever listen to Script Notes?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Okay, so Script Notes is a podcast with 2 screenwriters, Craig Mason and John August, and they're both highly accomplished writers. And Craig Mason, who wrote Chernobyl, is probably the most recent thing you guys might have seen. He did an episode on how to write a movie, and he also talks a lot about screenwriting books that are sort of sold to people if you know, save the cat or write a bestseller in half a day or whatever, you know, these sort of things. And he talks about how people talk about these very complex structures. And he says, oh, because at the end of the day, all of that is analysis that is done after the book is written or after the movie is written by somebody else. It's not going to help you as a writer to create something, because it's not asking the right question, which is why. You know, it's not like, what's your first turning point? What's your this? What's your whatever? It's like, why is that a turning point? Why is your character going to make that choice? Why does it matter? Why should the reader care? And those are the questions you need to answer. Like, there's certain things I'm definitely aiming at from a craft point of view. I want to be asking questions constantly so that you're going, oh, why did she do that anyway? And turn the page to get that sense of satisfaction. I want the chapters to be punchy, and I'm trying to make sure that every single scene earns its place in the book. I never want it to be boggy or boring. I never want you to be just reading something for the sake of it. If I'm doing that, then I know I'm doing it. Yeah. And afterwards it's going to end up on the floor, you know, I'll cut it.
It's something I used to teach creative writing to young kids, and you know, I go through all of these things because, you know, I think it is beneficial to learn those rules, like to learn, you know, your turning points and your midpoints and everything. But I think what I eventually settled on, because like when I was at film school, I really railed against that stuff. Like, I really struggled with it, mainly because it was pointing out all the deficiencies in my writing for years. But ultimately what I arrived at was that, you know, for every classic storytelling rule you can think of, you will be able to point to 10 classics that break it, you know?
Yeah.
And ultimately the way I think that is beneficial to think about this stuff is to be like, they're tools, not rules, you know? Those things can help you if you're stuck, and you're right, they can give you like something really effective to sort of, you know, hang story points on and to develop things from. But ultimately, if they're getting in the way of what's organic or what's right for the story, throw them out the window. Because, you know, they're just not, and ultimately they've got so little bearing on your audience experience, because, you know, your average readers aren't sitting there going like, oh yeah, cool, that's your first act turning point, and that's your midpoint, oh, that was a couple pages too late, so I don't know about that. You know, I don't even think that writers do that when they're reading things, you know, because you just take all the joy out of the experience of, yeah.
I agree with you. I think, look, at the end of the day, they can be useful tools, but when you're writing a novel, you're making about 1 million mini decisions. Every single word you choose, every single action, the color of somebody's hair, but even that makes it sound too macro. Like, there are 1 million decisions that go into making the book, and all of that is coming from who you are as a person. Yeah. What has formed you, you know, what you love, what you care about, what you hate, what bores you. All of that is coming from you. And my worry about the structural stuff is that while it's useful at the early stages, it's head work, not hard work. And if you're making all those decisions from your head, it might be quite a technically proficient book. And we read those all the time. You know, it's a book that you get and you go, oh, that was good entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. But you've literally forgotten it 2 days later. Someone said to you, oh, did you read that book? Was it any good? You'd be like, yeah, I think so. I can't remember anything though. You know, it's gone. So I don't really want you to remember, because the books I love are the ones that stay with me, that make me feel something. And those things come from heart, and they come from decisions you're barely conscious that you're making. It's instinct as a writer. You've read your book 100 times, you're still reading, going, that's not quite there, you know?
And it's almost like such a almost unquantifiable thing. You know, I knew this person when I was at film school who wrote the most technically proficient screenplays. You know, you couldn't, if you were following every classic rule of screenwriting, you couldn't fault a single decision this person made. But they were soulless.
Yeah.
You get to the end and it was like, you almost can't give feedback because what a horrible thing to say to somebody is that, you know, your writing is soulless. But like, also, how do you quantify that? Like, how do you boil that down? How do you quantify soul or heart in a story? It's a really hard thing, but you know it when you see it. It's unmistakable when there is truth and there is intention and there is, like, you know, the author is bearing something vulnerable in their story.
Yeah. I think you have to be always told that it's okay to do that too.
Yeah.
I think a lot of young writers probably don't know necessarily that that's what it's all about, because it's very hard to learn how to write a novel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it really comes from a lot of different places. And I think if I had started writing earlier, I probably would have made more of those mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes, but I probably would have made more of those. I think it took a bit of life, for me, it took a bit more life experience to be able to come to it and feel like I had something to say.
Yeah. It's that thing of, like, you know, there should be at least one scene in your book where you're, you know, showing off something you don't want to show off, you know, like just something vulnerable and something raw and something you're like, oh, God, I don't want people reading that. Yeah. That's a little bit too much. Well, on the note of screenwriting, The Murder Rule is being adapted into a TV show. So it's FX, yeah, which is amazing. Like, what a channel to have behind it. So obviously, I'm sure that there's very little you can say about that because of contracts and NDAs and everything. But for the purposes of myself and everybody here, what can you tell us about that and its development?
Gosh, I mean, just that I'm excited, I suppose, is the main thing. When my agent rang me to tell me that FX wanted it, I was super excited. I mean, okay, let's be honest, I didn't know FX. Because I don't live in America, you know, but FX is this really big cable company and they go into about 90 million homes and they're part of Disney, and virtually everybody who's cable in America has FX. And they've made really big shows like The Americans and Nip Tuck and stuff like that. And once I understood that, I was very excited. And my agent was excited. He was like, this guy hates everything and he likes this. So anyway, it was a really lovely moment. And the interesting thing for me is I've been able to contribute a little bit, you know, in that I'm not a screenwriter, I wouldn't know where to begin. But I was able to send in some of my stuff, you know, the background work I've done on my characters and, you know, background about the story, things I felt were really fundamentally important to it. And then I was able to get notes back from writers about what they thought and where they saw the ending going and what they felt about things that were important. And it's so fascinating to see other creative people come to your work and take something completely different from it, you know, and seeing the places where they overlapped with me, seeing the places where they would have gone a different direction. I mean, I would have read that all day. It was brilliant.
It's kind of it's a funny one, isn't it? Because there are some writers who are really, you know, very purist. It's like it's got to be exactly the same. You can't change anything, and I want it to be. Whereas I'm always the opposite. I'm just like, I'm so like not morbidly is the wrong word, but fascinated by the idea of somebody else coming in and taking the story in their own direction, because it's kind of like, you know, you almost sit there and take notes about, like, where did I screw this up? You know, like, what can a better mind than mine bring to this? You know, but it's just also exhilarating to be like something you've written has, you know, has sparked this in other creatives to build on it and, you know, make something their own out of your work. Like, what greater compliment could there possibly be? You know?
I couldn't agree more. I think it's enormously flattering that someone else is excited enough about your stuff to bring their own creativity to it.
Absolutely.
And I always feel like I got to do my thing. My thing is between the covers of the books. It's in the bookshops. It's finished. That's mine. And if someone else wants to come and make something new, that's amazing, you know? I really celebrate that, even if it is different from what I might have done.
And that's exactly it, because, you know, it's like you don't want an adaptation that feels like it's constrained by what's on the page. You want something that has the freedom to breathe and be its own work of art. And I mean, if you can sit back at the end and say, you know, I provided the germ from which that grew, but of course my vision was in the book. So, you know,
actually, it's really good, because if it's awesome, you get to take credit. If it's terrible, you get to say,
it's fantastic. I mean, the amount of authors who, like, you know, have turned around years later after a bad adaptation, they're like, oh, you know, they did this wrong, they did this wrong, they did this wrong, they did this wrong. And I'm like, if it had been well received, you probably wouldn't be saying any of that unless you see the team shining. So before we throw over some questions from the audience, because I'm sure everybody has heaps to ask, can you tell us anything about the next book?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm working on it at the moment. And I was saying last night, this is where, if I describe it, this is where you see how much authors work on polishing their pitches before we come talk to you about it, because I kind of meander all over the place and I'm trying to describe the story. But it's basically about a young couple who are very much in love. They're only just turned 18, and they're very well liked in their small community, really cared about. There's just something about these two. Maybe it's their love story, maybe it's just who they are as people. They're very much beloved, and both of their sets of parents are very embedded in the community as well. And this young couple goes away on a trip, and only he comes back. And he has an explanation as to what happened, but it's short, it's not very detailed, and even in that there's enough that people are going, oh, okay, but what? And they've got questions. But his parents close ranks straight away, and almost without even asking him, they're protecting him. Her parents are desperate to know what's happened, and everybody in the community starts taking sides. And as her parents are pushing and trying to get to the bottom of what actually took place, everything starts to unspool and kind of truths start to get uncovered and so on. And more stuff happens after that.
So I think I've picked everyone here what I'm saying. After today, you are going to be locking yourself away and finishing that the next month, so we can have that ASAP, right?
Of course,
Please.
of course, yes, it's around the corner.
No, that's fantastic. I feel like it, by the sounds of it, it speaks to all of those same themes about, how quickly people confirm their biases and take sides and lean into things, and how quickly that mob mentality can grow, which is very now,
Yeah,
and very relevant, and
yeah.
super interesting. I can't wait.
I'm having some fun with it at the moment.
Yeah, awesome. So good. All right. I will shut up and throw to some audience members if people have some questions. So throw your hands up and either I'll bring the mic around or you can call out. Yeah, in the back there.
Hi, Jenny. I would like to know where you got your idea from and to deal with Hazel.
Ooh, well. Okay, I won't tell you what Hannah did because you have to discover it. Trying to think, how did I think of that?
Could you repeat it?
Oh, sorry, sure. The question was, where did I get the idea for what Hannah did to Hazel, because it was very evil. I'm trying to think. I guess it was just my own innate badness. I think it's probably where it came from. I had to do a bit of research on some of what she could have done, specifically how she achieved it, the mechanics of it. But other than that, I think I just came up with it. Sorry.
The great thing about writing is that it lets you kind of put all of your most evil inclinations on the page and blame the characters and be like, no, I'm great.
Yeah, they can say that's why crime writers are so nice to each other.
Well,
They murdered everybody on the page.
Yeah, and because you know how to get away with it as well. Anybody else? Yes.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the creative process, which sounds chaotic. I'm sort of curious about a couple of things. What formed your reading and your love of literature to begin with, to what made you go down a particular path? And there seems to be, we've moved on from Agatha Christie and people like that to where the good old, I'm sorry, I'm not being demeaning, but the good old mystery story is now imbued with so many social issues and like you say, moral dilemmas. It's transformed the whole genre. And I just wonder if you have a comment on where did you start? What did you start reading?
So 2 questions, I think. The first one really is what formed us as writers, what we read. And the second was more to do with, we used to have stories that were stories, I guess, mystery stories. That's what they were. And now they're a bit kind of soaked in social issues and moral ambiguity and that sort of stuff. I mean, look, for me as a reader, the great joy for me as a kid was that nobody had a clue what I was reading, nor did they care. I mean, I look at my kids' bookshelves now and I'm pushing books on them, and it's all in fairness, they choose what they like. But most of the time, we're trying to curate our kids' bookshelf. I was reading, there were very few books in the house. I mostly read what my brothers left behind until I got my first paid babysitting job at 11. And then I could start buying books because I got paid £5 and a paperback cost £5. I read a lot of fantasy all through my teens and early 20s. And then at a certain point, I just found I was bringing home crime novels because that's where I was finding the writing I was looking for, The second question about moral ambiguity and social stuff. Look, I think we can take that way too far. I really just want a good story. You know, I really do. Life is too complicated as it is. When I'm going to the bookshops, I want a good story that I can disappear into and forget the world for a while. But for me, a good story has characters that I can love, you know, in a setting I want to spend time in, but also some stuff that my brain is going to want to chew over, you know. So I feel like there's a place for that as long as we don't overdo it. There's a place for it as it's in context and it makes sense. That's my take. What do you think, Gabe?
Well, in terms of where it started for me, like when my book The Hunter came out in 2020, well, no, before it came out, I sent an early copy to my parents. And my mum called me. She was like, "I read your books up." And I was like, what do you think, Mum? And she was like, I just want to know where I went wrong. And I didn't tell her what it was, but it was when I was 13 and Mum and Dad were very busy working. They didn't realise that I was reading Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. And after that, I just became obsessed with horror and I became obsessed with darker stories. And it was like when I was 10 and I saw Lord of the Rings for the first time. And then like 6 months later, Dad's like, "Oh, we're going to go to the movies." He takes me to see Scooby-Doo. And I'm like, "I don't want to watch that anymore. I want to watch more of that." And it was the same when I read Red Dragon. You know, I wasn't going back to YA literature after that. So I just read a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have been reading at a very young age. And I guess that warped me. But as to the social issues question, it's so interesting because, you know, I think that, you know, we should be able to explore anything. And, you know, I think that literature is a great place to be able to explore challenging ideas and contemporary ideas. Where I get frustrated with it is if I feel like the book is predominantly existing to send a message or to hit me over the head with a political points, because at that point it becomes propaganda, not literature.
Yeah.
And I am much more interested in stories, and this is why I love The Murder Rule so much. I'm much more interested in stories that ask questions and are not afraid to not give you an easy answer, but like leave you with something that you can chew on. You can think, "Oh, was that right? Was that wrong? Was that," you know, like questions, stories that don't just kind of tell you this is how you have to think about this or X or Y or whatever. But, you know, I mean, I also think that being really like politicized or whatever in your storytelling, you can also date a story. Like, you know, if something's really in the zeitgeist, or if you write something that's like really heavily about Trump, it's like, well, you fast forward 3 years and it's just like, well, that was a very obvious moment.
We hope.
Yeah, fingers crossed. But, you know, if you want to write something that's built to last, it's like, I think you want to be a bit more universal than immediate in what you're talking about. So, yeah, I don't know, that's my take, but it's a contentious issue that people, you know, some people think that art has a responsibility to be of the moment, and that's a completely valid viewpoint as well, but just not one I entirely agree with.
Thank you.
Yes.
You've got.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
All good. You get this.
Okay, sorry. You've got 3 novellas on Audible.
Yes.
And I believe they're only available audiobooks. So you obviously like audiobooks.
Yeah.
Can you why you just chose to release them on audiobooks? And do you have any input into how the audiobooks are made or narrated?
Well, the reason they're only on Audible is because they're Audible exclusive. So Audible came to me and asked if I would write some Audible exclusives for them as part of, I guess, their marketing thing. So they approach writers sometimes and they ask that. And so you agree, if you agree to do it, you sign a contract that says that for a period of time, they will only be published in audio format. Publish them eventually, because I think some people want to read them. There's The Sisters, The Roommate, and now most recently The Wrong One. They've been really fun to write. There's something quite freeing about the fact that I feel less pressure, I think, for those. I don't know why, because I want them to be really good, but I feel like I can kind of play with them a little bit more. And it's interesting writing knowing that it's going to be performed, because you know the narrator is going to bring something to it, sometimes a lot. So when I'm writing that, I can leave out things like attributions. I don't need to have as much he said, she said, or even describing the way people say things. I mean, you can't say things like, "Dance with me," she said coquettishly. You know what I mean? You can't do that because it's cheesy in writing. So you have to find a way to describe how she's behaving a bit more subtly. Sometimes you don't need to do as much of that work when it's written for audio, because you can, you know, the narrators know what's happening and they can bring something to the story. I do get to choose my narrators, which has been great. Aoife McMahon narrated all my Irish books, and she's amazing. I was very lucky to find her, and I asked my publisher if we could get her, and she was able. She's just done a brilliant job. More recently, I was able to choose my American narrators. Usually you get sent a list and some sound bites and stuff, and you choose people that way. So it's been a really cool experience.
Yeah, it's really fun. I've done an Audible original as well, and it's like when they came to me, they came to me with it. I was like, I'm going to take. There was this one character I really liked in The Inheritance, and I was like, I'm going to tell his story, and I was like, I'm going to write it first person. I'm going to write it formed because like you realise it's not designed to be read; it's designed to be heard.
Yeah.
So you can lean into it, and it does give you the sort of different fun thing to explore. So it's a really cool medium, and it's a really interesting way to tell the story. And yeah, there was a question back there.
You wrote Stephen King as technically all authors you like to read. Who else do you like to read?
The question is, other than Stephen King, who else do we like to read? Gosh, there's so many writers that I would love and admire, but writers that I kind of chase off to the bookshop for. Anthony Horowitz, I'm so enjoying his Magpie Murders series. Ruth Ware, anything she writes, I love. And it's funny when you mention like a kind of traditional mystery, because they're very much that sort of book, you know, really good story. Stephen King's always been a really big favourite. His book Ulysses Story is probably one of my favourites ever. Don Winslow is a big fan. I'm a big fan of Karen Slaughter. I think it's just going from strength to strength. Like I've read one of hers recently, and she does that thing in the first chapter where she just really surprises you, just takes you aback, that really good writers can do to draw you in. And then I turn the page, and 3 pages later she does it again, and then again, and then again. Like literally she did it 5 times in about 3 chapters, at which point she is literally just showing off. That shouldn't be allowed.
For me, it's Tana French. She's just my absolute idol. Like, oh, she's incredible. When I read In the Woods for the first time, it was like a feast. You know, some books are like fast food. You read them really quickly, forget about them, whatever. Other books are like, you know, it's like a nice frothy dessert or something. Then you read something like In the Woods, which is so beautifully written, so robustly characterized, and so like saturated in atmosphere. And then you realize that all of her books are that good. And it's like, how do you like, it's just, I just think she's the absolute master of her craft, and I will read anything that she writes and then sob in the shower afterwards because I'm never going to be that good. But I think, are we at time? One more question. Fight for it. Yes.
I've got 2 quick ones. Ali as well, and my question is probably for Dervla in terms of your new book. So when are you planning to have that published? And you obviously started your career in law. Was the plan always to get into writing, or how did your journey sort of turn into that?
Okay. When am I planning to publish the next book, and how did I get into writing from law? So the short version of the law question is, I was a lawyer in Ireland for 12 years. I started a little practice when I was 26 in the west of Ireland. It was very successful until it really wasn't. And the GFC hit us very hard, and my practice just kind of crumbled under the weight of it. And we kind of pushed on for another 3 or 4 years, my husband and I, and it just got harder and harder. And by the end of it, I just never wanted to practice law again. We moved to Australia in 2011. Second child was born 5 weeks after we landed. Didn't sleep for 2 years. Awesome. But by 2014, I was working during the day. I liked my job a lot, but I knew it wasn't like we came to Australia in the hope of being able to do things differently and kind of, not to sound cheesy, but pursue our dreams a little bit. And writing was my dream. So I started writing at night, every night except Thursdays. And by 2016, October 2016, I'd signed my first contract with Harper for the Ruma. So it was remarkably fast, really, in the scheme of things, and I've been very lucky. The other question about when I plan to publish my next book makes me laugh the way you asked it, because I'm thinking of Kimberly down the back of the room going, she doesn't get to decide that. It's definitely a process. I'm hoping to finish it by August, but there's an editorial process that goes on, and then there's a whole lot that the publisher has to do to bring a book to market that takes months of work. So it depends on how quickly that can be done, I guess. Sometime next year, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for such an enjoyable and interesting conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I could see plenty of nods and smiles from a very full room. Thank you all for being here. Thank you both for being here. Also wanted to thank the Sun Bookshop, our partners down the back, and also publisher HarperCollins for facilitating this today. I just also wanted to thank you again all for being here, and for those online. Bit of a pioneer, it's our first live stream event, so hopefully you're enjoying that from home. Yes, the Sun Bookshop has copies of Gabriel and Dervla's books for sale, so feel free to head down. Dervla and Gabriel will have time to sign copies as well. Thank you very much for that. Keep an eye on our Facebook page and on our website for our upcoming events. We've left hot off the press the what's on for June and July on your seats there, so see what else is coming up, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you again both for being here.